The trail they ascended was the one Lewis and Clark had taken down into their country, and Weepy Prairie, where they had just made their decision to leave home, was where Nez Perces had seen their first white men in 1805. There the Nimipu, the real people, had spared the starving explorers and fed them salmon and berries. It was also at Weepy, on the return trip, that William Clark had sired a son, Halachatucket, daytime smoke. He was among the non-treaties. Now 70, wow, he moved up the Lolo Trail with a family that included Clark's granddaughter and a great-grandson. Together they reversed the steps his father had taken to set in motion the forces now sending the Nez Perces out of the homeland Coyote had given them. Chapter 10, Leaving Home. The Lolo Trail ran about 100 miles north and east from Weepy Prairie over the Bitterroot Mountains. It began at 3,000 feet above sea level and rose in places to well above twice that. Sherman wrote later that it was universally admitted to be one of the worst trails for man and beast on this continent. On both sides of the divide, it was no straight incline, but a series of peaks and troughs that sometimes dipped or rose more than 2,000 feet in a mile. Parts of the twisting path were rocky and barren, parts muddy and slick in wet weather. The thick timber closed in for much of the way, and in places it was scarcely a footpath along the rims of canyons hundreds of feet deep. During the summer it was bisected by dozens of freshets. A dependable road was not built over the pass until 1962. The threat of ambush was made clear even before the Army started its pursuit. On July 16th, as the Nez Perces started up the trail, Howard sent Major E.C. Mason with cavalry, some civilians, and Nez Perce scouts to reconnoiter. When signs of an Indian presence increased, Mason sent the scouts ahead of him to fill out any threat of concealed attack. A good thing, as the Nez Perce rearguard fired on them from thick timber, killing one and wounding two. Mason and his horsemen abandoned the scouts with their casualties and scampered back to camp. Howard's first plan was to avoid the pass entirely and take his men onto a long looping route twice as long as the Lolo Trail, but so much easier and faster that, he thought, he could be waiting for the Nez Perces at the end of their crossing. From Lewiston, he would move north to the Mullen Road, one of those government projects that had begun to stitch the West together on the eve of the Civil War, and follow it eastward across the Bitterroots to Missoula City, a short march from the trail's eastern terminus. Page 70. Again, local concerns spoiled his plans. There were dark rumors that other plateau groups would rise up as soon as the troops left, and some feared that the band's move up the Lolo Trail was only a feint before roaring back once Howard was gone. A threat that seemed real when some Nez Perce raiders hit the reservation settlement near Kamaya and made off with about 400 horses. The raiders had only doubled back briefly before rejoining the others up the trail, but the strike threw locals into consternation scarcely equaled by the Caracas people in an earthquake. Pressured by civilians, perceiving enemies literally left and right, and worried about being outmaneuvered yet again, Howard decided to wait for help. Ow! Ow. I'm okay, I just swallowed an air bubble. Troops were coming north from Fort Boise, and in a dramatic demonstration of the nation's expanding infrastructure, 10 companies of the 2nd Infantry would soon arrive, having come all the way from Atlanta via railroad and steamboat in only 16 days. Wow. Meanwhile, Howard gave arms to civilians and commercial travelers, put a strong guard around Lewiston, and kept his men in a defensive posture. Howard's new plan broke his increased command into three parts. The first stayed in Idaho to tamp down any new trouble. The second moved west, discouraged plateau peoples from joining the resistance, and then took the Mullen Road, following Howard's original plan, and waited at Missoula. The third, the main column, Howard led in pursuit of the bands over the Lolo Trail. He hoped he could still catch them or trap them between his own men and those at the other end. On July 30th, Howard set off up the Lolo Trail with battalions of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, 14 companies in all, with more than 700 officers and enlisted men, along with civilian volunteers, Indian scouts, and packers hired for a train of 350 mules, bearing supplies and rations for nearly 3 weeks. In a steady rain, men, horses, and mules trudged through a sop of mud. The trail steepened and tapered to a path through thick underbrush, tangled vines, and a forest of white pine and spruce. The men were, quote, climbing one mountain for miles, only to plunge again into a deep gorge. An officer wrote home, more tiresome work. The trail sometimes widened onto vistas, sometimes passed through marshes, sometimes funneled into a narrow track blocked by fallen trees. The climb was difficult and wearing. They found several dead horses left by the bands ahead of them, but the 2-mile-long column still traversed up to 22 miles a day and passed the summit on August 6th. By now, Howard knew something of the Nez Perces' whereabouts, and the news was not good. They had left earlier than he had thought, made good time, passed the summit, and reached a traditional camping spot by some hot springs around July 23rd, a full week before he had left. Long before Howard's other troops might arrive to plague their exit, they were off to the Lolo Trail and pushing toward the Crows and Buffalo country along the traditional route that ran southward up the Bitterroot River. By August 6th, as Howard topped the Lolo summit, they had traveled the length of the Bitterroot Valley and ascended the next range of mountains. They were at least 150 miles ahead. An officer would note dryly that it was still possible to overtake Joseph by the time he reaches New York. Events along the way had been both confused and revealing, and, at moments, almost comic. Word had leaked to Montana that the Nez Perces might be headed that way, and whites at the eastern end of the Lolo Trail were understandably nervous. The nearest railhead was the Union Pacific at Corinne, Utah. The nearest telegraph was at Deer Lodge, nearly 70 miles away. And the closest troops were 2 undermanned companies under Captain Charles Rawne at Missoula City. On July 18th, Rawne, R-A-W-N, sent a party up the trail to check for approaching Indians. By their later report, they went well past the Lolo summit and back, yet found nothing to worry them, which meant they somehow managed to pass more than 700 persons, 2,000 horses, and hundreds of dogs along a narrow path without noting anything amiss. They then came across 4 persons, 3 Nez Perces and a mixed blood, then living in the Bitterroot Valley, who told them of the bands descending toward Montana. This word threw the settlements in a near panic. Governor Benjamin Potts wired General McDowell for help. McDowell asked whether Potts could arrest the Nez Perces. Unlikely, Potts answered testily, since Washington had denied him permission to raise a militia. Then he raised one anyway. Missoula's newspaper sent out the call, "Help! Help! Come running!" At Stevensville, the town nearest the Lolo Trail outlet, locals shored up a crumbling trade outpost with fresh sod bricks and built 2 more defenses at Corvallis and Hamilton to the south. The first they named Fort Brave, the others, in bleak self-deprecation, they called Fort Skedaddle and Fort Run. Other communities spontaneously formed units of armed volunteers that now moved toward the Lolo outlet. On July 25th, Rawne took his tiny command of about 35 men up the lower reaches of the trail. About 4 miles up, where the canyon narrowed, his men began felling trees for an emplacement to block the way out. It was audacious on the face of it, with the warriors outnumbering his troops by more than 6 to 1, but he had the advantage of a defensive position, and citizens were starting to gather, about 50 at the time, with more coming in. By the next day, their numbers roughly equaled that of the Indians against them. On July 25th and 26th, soldiers and civilians worked the site into a rude fortification with walls of 2 or 3 stacked logs atop a mound of dirt pitched from a trench dug with trowel bayonets.